So let's now put that into this association of climatic interactions and think about where our best examples of significant volumes of evaporites, especially halite, are accumulating. And what's interesting when we do that is we find that in continental evaporites, they don't accumulate in very hot and very dry settings. They tend to accumulate in what are known as cool arid deserts or cool arid steppe environments, often in high altitude positions. Hot arid desert sumps under the old Koeppen climate, the BWH, don't necessarily equate to accumulations of significant volumes of laterally extensive bedded evaporites. We also need to have a brine source. So into this system, a lot of these hot arid deserts are too dry to facilitate the long-term presence of a brine, except in coastal positions where we've got the ocean nearby. In some of these deserts that are in continental high altitude positions especially, there may be reworking of the salt from earlier times of salt accumulation, but most importantly, reworking of diapiric salt gives us significant volumes in many of the larger, purer halite accumulations in the world's deserts. We also need to ask the question, what other quaternary climates can accumulate and preserve significant bedded salt deposits? Here's the typical Köppen-Geiger climate map. This comes from a paper by Beck and others, where you can see the red belts pretty much correspond to positions of hot saline geosystem. So they are the Hadley cell controlled positions. But north of India, we have what are the BWK, the cool arid deserts, extending quite a way north of the Hadley cell positions. And then surrounding that and surrounding most deserts, we get the cool desert association in the browns. But there are a variety of other positions we can look at, and we looked at some of them in our discussion, for example, of Korobagaz Gol at the edge of the Caspian Sea, where we had localized conditions where we had deserts facilitating, along with cryogenic precipitation, significant volumes of sodium sulfate salts. You can't generalize that we form evaporites only in zones where we have Hadley cells. There are other local controls that also control those positions. So once again, we'll come back to that map. We started off this discussion. This time I've superimposed the areas that are saline more than 250 square kilometres in area, and I've put it on that Koeppen map. And it's interesting that you see that many of these deposits, especially around the hot arid deserts, for example, of the Sahara, we don't have large accumulations of saline areas. The deserts are regolith and loose sediment, maybe dunes and outcrop of older rocks, but we don't see a lot of saline accumulations over significant areas. They tend to sit around the coastal zones where there's more moisture input coming off the coastal zones. The desert interior of Australia is a little different. It's a milder desert, but they tend to sit in association with old paleo drainage channels. And we'll come back and look at this distribution in a lot more detail. I refer you back to chapter 2 in the book, which accompanies this course, my book, and you'll get more breakdown of the actual individual accumulations and styles. For now, I just want to summarize it in terms of the climatic overlay between the Koppen climates, elevation, and type and style and desert position. This is showing us the position of what are documented as modern sabkas, these capillary evaporation salts, and also saline pans. And you can see that for modern sabkas, on that left-hand diagram, they pretty much confine to positions of the Hadley cells. And they range mostly in the northern hemisphere into what are hot, dry, arid deserts, the red dots, whereas in the southern hemisphere we do see hot, dry, arid deserts like in Lake Frome. But we also get significant salt accumulations like Atacama and Uyuni in desert systems which are cool, arid BWK associations. And if we look at where those deserts sit on the right-hand map, you can see that the majority of the deserts sit at sea level or a little bit above sea level, but some, like Atacama and Uyuni, extend all the way up. So saline pans don't just form from marine feeds. We've got a whole range of very significant volumes forming in the inland high altitude regions of Atacama and Uyuni. But you can see from the latitudinal plot, the left-hand diagram, all modern sabkas and pans pretty much lie beneath Hadley cells, and most of them occur at elevations near sea level. Let's contrast that with our saline lakes. We have a range of saline lakes, some of which are extending down into the African Rift Valley lakes, like Lake Natron and Lake Magadi, into what are tropical climates. But there it's adiabatic restriction of moisture coming in the depression. There's the Rift Valley that's allowing sodium carbonate salts to accumulate. But in general, looking at that diagram on the left, most of the perennial saline water bodies that we're plotting here plot once again within that Hadley cell range, within the descending arm of Hadley cells. We see most of the significant accumulations. Some lie a little bit outside on the north of that belt, like Koeppen and Isikul and Great Salt Lake. And in those lakes, there's also a significant contribution in terms of the volume of salts accumulating from cryogenic salts. And we'll come back and look at the cryogenic association in higher latitude positions in a separate section a bit later in the course. If we plot up elevation in terms of perennial saline lakes, there's a much broader spread of positions with respect to elevation. And that is because in elevated areas, we tend to see slower rates of evaporation. We have more time for surface waters to remain in the depositional environment than we do in the warmer arid areas. Modern saline lake distribution is somewhat broader than just beneath Hadley zones, with a greater spread into saline higher elevations. And some of these sites, as we said in Lake Natron and Lake Magadi, the blue triangles in the middle of that left-hand plot, are there because of adiabatic restriction in what is an equatorial zone. If we compare the two plots now in terms of the Hadley cells with sabkas on the left and perennial saline lakes on the right, that general observation that the Hadley cells are important is true, but in terms of perennial water bodies, there's a bit more spread of the distribution series, controlled by local adiabatic effects and also some input from cryogenic brine freezing effects, which we'll look at particular examples of those in a later section in the course. Let's have a look at water depth within these saline perennial lakes, and we can see that the majority of saline perennial lakes which have halite accumulating in the system are shallow. There are a few meters to tens of meters in depth. Isikul, Van Gelu, and the Caspian are not at levels of salinity that are halite precipitated. You can see that Lake Van in a CSA climatic belt has a salinity of about 24 parts per mil, so it's less saline than seawater. Isikul is certainly much less saline than seawater. It's brackish with a salinity of 6 parts per thou, as is Pyramid Lake and Salar de Atacama in Turkey. They're all not all that saline if they have 100 meter plus water depths. The exception is the Dead Sea. This Dead Sea today, since February 1979, is holomictic, and the whole column is at halite saturation, around 350 parts per mil. Koeppen, which is in a cool arid steppe region of the world, outside of the Hadley cells, still has a salinity up around 300 parts per mil. It's getting up there, but the most of that salinity is coming from cryogenic concentration, not from solar evaporation. And we'll come back to that a little later. But as a general rule, you can say that saline lakes that are accumulating salts, more saline than calcite aragonite dolomite couplets, that is salinities greater than 70 parts per thou, tend to be shallow. In the continental setting, they tend to be rivers fed. In the coastal setting, they tend to be seepage fed from seawater seeping in through some sort of aquifer system, and their brines are shallow, with typically depths less than 10 metres. The other observation we could say, based on this climatic plot, is that large, deep perennial saline lakes require milder arid climates and some sort of reliable income compared to the sabkas of the world, where the less saline lakes tend to have greater areas and to hold more total salts. You look at the total salts in the Caspian, the Aral Sea, and Lake Urmia. They have much higher volumes than many of the other plots in the system, with the exception of the saline pan systems in Atacama and Uni. And of course, Koeppen sits outside of this because it's a cryogenically enhanced system. But basically, we need sufficient time and sufficient volume of water coming into those systems to allow perennial evaporites to accumulate. The next plot's interesting in that it shows you over time. So the horizontal axis is the year, and the vertical axis is the percentage of the lake compared to its shoreline defining its maximum position. You can see in all of these lakes in semi-arid areas, the lakes are in decline. Certainly since 1950, all of these lakes, or most of these lakes, are in significant decline. So as a general rule, you can say that water volumes and lake levels in most of the world's largest saline lakes in semi-arid and arid conditions are shrinking. Now, some people have said this is due to climate change, but this really, in my mind, got nothing to do with climate change. What's happening here is salinisation and shrinkage of these systems related to the uptake of the freshwater influx in these semi-arid climate belt lakes by irrigation systems. Now, we have orchards, we have vegetable plots along the inflows, the rivers like the Jordan River, like the River Murray coming into the Coorong region. They are all pulling significant volumes of water, fresh water, out of the upstream positions in the feeds to these lakes, Lake Urmia as well. And so we have this reduction in inflow causing the shrinkage of these lakes. It's not climate change, it's too many people taking too much water out of the inflow areas into these lakes. So these are mostly due to anthropogenic over-extraction in the water catchment feeding into these lakes. And they're largely unrelated to any sort of short-term climate oscillations. We've over-exploited and over-extracted water and degraded the soils and the other resources in the drainage catchments around all of these shrinkage lakes. We have to do this. We have to feed a population that's continuing to grow. Now and well into the next 30 or 40 years, the world's population will continue to grow, and there's more people relying on what is an increasingly limited source of water and soil resource in these systems. It's a pretty grim picture tied back to too many people. The problem is that, politicians and religious leaders are mostly unwilling or unable to address the background to why we're getting so many people. It's an improvement in the level of medical care in most of the world. I mean, poverty levels are shrinking per capita around the world still because of the technological improvements we've made for world health. But there's another underlying factor here, and that's religious superstition. We're still, in many religions, we are still encouraging people to have bigger families. Not a good idea when you're seeing shrinkage, especially in these semi-arid parts of the world, of the resource. And it's unrelated to climate change. Much easier for a politician to blame climate change than to say, here, we have to make these religiously unpopular decisions to limit the number of people in a family. In general, all of these semi-arid to hyper-arid conditions follow the rule, occasionally it rains and floods the system. We freshen it up. Might be every decade, every 50 years even in the hyper-arid deserts, but occasionally we will see rainfall and flooding of those systems. Now, that occasional input can be quite catastrophic in terms of the depositional and the cultural features around these lakes. Arid deserts are subject to an unpredictable and variable rates of water inflow. And so these desert downpours, these storm-induced downpours in the drainage hinterland create these debris-charged raging torrents in what are normally dry stream beds feeding into the sumps where the various saline salts are accumulating. At that time, we'll see sheet flooding around the margins of these continental systems, and we may see a range of cross-bedded and rippled sand sheets interlaid with vast areas of muddy floodplains where capillary evaporation takes place and salts are accumulating after these occasional freshening events. Here's a few catastrophic events listed in terms of when they occurred, how much rainfall was there compared to the average annual rainfall in these areas. In some of these zones, we can have levels of precipitation at the time of the storms which exceed the annual input, and these can create all sorts of problems for the people living in those systems. They can be visually quite impressive. Here's a flash flood in Wadi Nahal draining into the Dead Sea on March the 19th. This is normally a dry wadi, but after that rainstorm, this happens, and of course this is feeding this suspended clay sediment into the Dead Sea. Over the broad scale, when we have all these inputs, be it into Lake Eyre, be it into the Dead Sea, be it into Great Salt Lake, those ephemeral inputs dry up. So in a day or two after the storm event's passed, that influx of water will convert as the lakes start to dry into a saline pan sump, generally filled with brackish water. As we saw in the source rock course, these may be times when we get a mesohaline, halo-tolerant fauna flourishing in these lake waters that are ponded in these sump depressions. But at the same time, we're moving huge volumes of siliciclastic sediments in and around into the region. Then as it starts to dry out, and that can take weeks to months or even years, we will have capillary evaporation occurring. And in Lake Eyre, for example, we also see as those regions of newly formed suspended load sediment accumulation come into the system, especially in the northern parts, you can see the halite crust in the southern parts. There's not much deflation of sediment, not much dust coming off the southern part because that area is covered in a salt crust. But in the northern part, where those areas are exposed, you get these large volumes of aeolian transported dust moving out of these sumps into the adjacent areas. We looked at this a little earlier when we looked at how saline clays get into arid sumps, the importance of aeolian transport in these systems, and discovered that this is a dust hotspot in the southern hemisphere, the Lake Eyre Basin, where we have a lot of dust being fed off this system. It's a region of deflation. And where we have a lot of deflation, we don't have a lot of salt accumulation. Since the Miocene, about 4 metres of halite have accumulated in that southern end of the Lake Eyre Basin. Most of it is dried out, most of it's deflated away. Sumps in continental regions can be zones where we have salt accumulating, like we do in the high Andes, or they can be areas of deflation, as we see here in the Lake Eyre Basin. So what can we say? Well, to get a modern halite accumulation based on these various settings that we've discussed, we need a large interior drainage basin. So typically we're looking at a tectonic basin. Quite often they're fault-defined high altitude intermontane positions, as they are in the Andes. They can form in both divergent and convergent settings, or strike slip settings, as we've got in the Dead Sea. What aids the accumulation of halite in any of those three settings is if we have pre-existing halite beds and reworked diapiric associations. If we look on the coastal margin deserts, where we see a range of sea edge sumps, locally in salinas, or in evaporitic mudflats, tidal flats, capillary salts are accumulating, we see the contrast between the coastal sabkas with their capillary responses, or typically smaller examples where we see 10-metre thick sections of Holocene subaqueous evaporite accumulating, like we'd see in Lake McLeod or Lake McDonald on the coastal salinas of southern Australia. Most of the accumulations that we see in these saline geosystems are smaller scale, they're thinner, and they're rarer. So we see in or interdrar sumps, we see wind deflation hollows, we see abandoned fluvial valleys, we see small accumulations in volcanic craters in semi-arid regions, and on the broader scale with a longer time frame, as we'll discuss in the final climate association, bolide craters are quite important in determining the nature and the type of salt, and also short-term climatic conditions, as we'll talk about looking at the Archean, and also having a look at the end of the Mesozoic, the extinction of the dinosaurs related to the impact of a large bolide. Then we've got a whole group of salts, which we're not going to get into in our discussion in this section. These are the cryogenic salts. Now, cryogenic salts are not true evaporites, as the driving mechanism is brine freezing. They're not solar-driven evaporites. When we look at deserts and we look at salts accumulating in them, we see salts accumulating in belts where we have a Hadley cell, typically true deserts, the hot arid or the cool arid settings, but there's a whole range of other climate modes where we see low levels of evapotranspiration, lower annual temperatures, slower rates of brine loss, we can accumulate our salt. And that passes up into the regions where we see cryogenic deserts, and we'll talk about these when we look at Cotopaxi Gold, for example. There are also regions that may fall under an ice cap, like we see in the Antarctic systems, which we'll discuss in the cryogenic section later in the course. Just to finish off this introduction to cryogenic salts, here we've got the typical desert belts of the world on the left-hand portion of that diagram, where we have super arid to peri-arid conditions, and we have low regions of moisture input. But notice that those white polygons across the top of this diagram are regions where we have water being lost in a solid form. We're extracting water as ice, we're not evaporating it, and that creates polar deserts, and we'll talk about those a little later in the course. Holocene climate controls modern continental evaporites typically accumulate within groundwater discharge sumps in semi-arid to hyper-arid deserts, typically tied to Hadley cells on the world scale. The marine-fed coastal evaporites in what are coastal edge deserts, typically in coastal flats with a capillary feed, or the occasional smaller area sub-sea level salina, where we get subaqueous evaporite accumulations, have a significant input of marine seepage waters. And then we have the cool climate salts, the cryogenic salts, which we'll talk about in the later section, don't form by direct solar concentration, so they're not true evaporites. But brine freezing then plays a much more important role in the crystallization of those salts. the hydrohalites, the antarcticite, the mirabilite, those salts that are accumulating in these cryogenic systems. If we look at the aerial extent of modern Holocene evaporites, there's an interesting relationship that was underlined by Lucia and then subsequently reworked by Hanford in a couple of papers in 1972 and 91, where they plotted the relative ratio of the inflow area, A subscript I, to the overall area of the total evaporite accumulating region. What they found was that if you're going to form any significant volume of evaporite getting up into the gypsum and halite accumulation, you need significant restriction. I mean, the only thing in there that's in the gypsum range, with salinities in excess of 200 parts per mil, is Koeppen gold. And Koeppen gold has ratio to area of inflow ratio of 2 by 10 to the 7. If you look at every example in the world, which I've drawn on the bottom part of that chart, where there's no surface inflow, but there's a seepage inflow, that's where the salts are accumulating. If we have a hydrographic connection in the Holocene, we don't see salts accumulating until we cut off that connection, as we did in Lake McLeod, Lake McDonald, and Lake Osceola. Once we cut off that surface connection, we can then generate a evaporite mass in that isolated, hydrographically isolated position. There's still inflow taking place here, but it's taking place at much slower rates of seepage coming off the adjacent isochemical reservoir of the nearby ocean. Put it all together, what have we learned from the Holocene? We've learned that we need a deep hole in the ground to accumulate thick halite beds. We've got to have a sufficient brine source. We've got to have sufficient subsidence to maintain that sump hydrology. We've got to have hydrographic isolation. We can't connect it up with a surface body of water like the ocean. And based on what we discussed earlier, when the brine column is holomictic, then we can have a whole range of water depths in that system, as we saw in the Dead Sea, where we've got halite accumulating on the bottom of a 300-metre thick brine column. It's happening all at the same time across the whole basin. The relative proportion in any of these systems, we've only got the Dead Sea as our current example, but we can extrapolate to ancient examples. The relative proportion of deep versus shallow beds and their mineralogy will depend on the hydrologic equilibrium rates of inflow versus brine loss. Long-term brine permanence, holding the brine in a position that's long-term and keeping the brines and the pore brines around it and under that evaporite at high levels of salt saturation are fundamental. Within that framework, as we'll consider for the rest of this section, are particular climatic, tectonic or eustatic factors contributing to the types of salts we'll see. And as we saw earlier in the course, the textures that we see, the evaporite textures, are indicating particular hydrologies. Our models are based on what we saw in the Holocene in these cool arid belts, coastal and inland, but we extrapolate those textures back into the ancient. We always think of it in terms of the scale of the hydrologies in the Holocene are much smaller than the scale of what we see in ancient evaporite depositional systems. So the present is the key in terms of process and this notion of the Hadley cells and also of adiabatic restriction, of upwelling and continentality. But when we look at past evaporites, the scale, the distribution of the climate belts, the eustatic response in greenhouse versus our current icehouse positions, and the appropriate plate tectonic continent-continent proximity positions will vary through time. So our Holocene models are useful in terms of process, but we're looking at different scales and associations in the past.